Good morning, everyone. This is Corey Stye, your host for today's webinar. Thank you for joining us for How to Support Students Learning English in the Classroom, presented by Dr. Lori Helman, professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Minnesota, where she is also director of the Minnesota Center for Reading Research. Lori researches and teaches classes in literacy development, reading difficulties, effective teaching practices for multilingual students, and works with literacy professionals to implement school-wide systems of support. Dr. Helman is the author or co-author of 16 books, including 2 books just released in 2020 on assessing and supporting emergent bilingual students. She has written chapters, journal articles, and curriculum support materials that investigate literacy learning with diverse students, and we're thrilled to have her here today to impart some of her knowledge and wisdom with us. Before I turn it over to Dr. Helman, just a couple of housekeeping items. We have set aside 60 minutes for today's webinar. It will begin with Dr. Helman's presentation. Following the presentation, Lori and I will have an interview-style discussion to delve more deeply into today's topics. Through that discussion, Lori will be answering participant questions, both those submitted via registration and perhaps some offered live during our discussion. So if you should have a question for Dr. Helman, please submit it in the chat window. You should have all received links to the handouts for today's meeting in the meeting reminder email. The handouts are also available from the meeting panel if you'd like to download and print them now. Many of you have also asked about a recording of this webinar. We'll be sending out follow-up emails with links to the recording in about 24 hours, so please look for that in your inbox. Feel free to share the recording with anyone at your school or district who you think would benefit from this very valuable information. Finally, if you are having technical difficulties, please contact GoToWebinar support. Their phone number is listed at the bottom of the meeting panel. And now, without any further delay, it is my pleasure to pass the virtual microphone off to Dr. Lori Helman, your presenter for today's Read Naturally webinar. Lori?
Thank you so much, Corey. It's great to be here, and I appreciate all of the folks who are spending their time learning on this very important topic. So I'm looking forward to the presentation. Just to build a little bit on what Corey said about me previously, a little bit more background. Before I was at the University of Minnesota, I was an elementary bilingual teacher for 16 years and also served as my district's literacy coordinator. Another thing I did for several years was be a leader in a new teacher mentoring program. And of course, now I'm at the university. But many of my reflections and anecdotes come from all of those experiences, not just the experience of being at the university. So I'm definitely with you out there in classrooms and knowing what's going on for kids there. The focus of today's webinar is on improving schooling for students learning in a new language. And the things I'd like to highlight are things that teachers can do. How can teachers increase their capacity for making their instruction more explicit so that it is understandable to language learners, so that you can engage students in interaction so they get to practice that language, and also valuing students' home language resources and making bridges to connect that to learning English. These are 3 key practices that will really increase the effectiveness of instruction for students learning English in the classroom. Today's talk is centered around a new ASCD book that I'm excited to announce. It's called Learning in a New Language, as you can see from the picture, and it presents a school-wide approach to support K-8 emergent bilinguals. The focus of today's webinar, we can't cover everything that's in the book, but I'm actually going to focus on the parts that are most relevant to teachers as they work to individually improve their instruction for students in the classroom. If you look at the chapters in the book, they cover a wide range, including a lot of school-wide issues and focus areas, including multi-tiered systems of support and equity and professional learning. But what we'll focus on today are the 3 that are circled in red: literacy practices, language practices, and content area practices that teachers can tweak their instruction, enhance their instruction to make them more understandable and more appropriate for the students who are learning in a new language. So let's get into it. Let's talk about key practice number 1, which is enhancing explicitness. Now, why do we need to enhance explicitness in our instruction? The main reason is that students need to understand, they need more clues than just a running stream of language in order to understand our instructions, whether that instruction is procedural or if it's content knowledge. So when we use visuals, hands-on materials, when we make connections between picture and print, or when we translate or demonstrate or model, what happens is students understand what we're teaching in more than just an oral way. So this makes the lessons easier for them to understand and follow. Here I put a picture of a menu that I was at a restaurant. I traveled a bit in Asia recently, and it's often really difficult, especially if the text is a different style and the words you don't know, to even figure out what you're ordering, what's going to come to your plate. So I love menus like this. They're so explicit. They've got pictures, they've got prices, they've got translations. I can point, I can attach words, and I can even learn new words by saying them. And even if I don't understand the script in the language where I'm speaking and where I'm visiting. Anyway, this is a great example of how sometimes restaurants enhance explicitness. Now, what can we do in our classrooms to enhance this explicitness as well? So what we can do is enhance explicitness by highlighting critical information for students. In other words, if we're giving them a lot of information in either oral or written form, can we focus on some key words? Can we cull it down to some key phrases that allow them to really understand what's important? That can happen through stressing the words, through using bold, through minimizing excessive words, lots of different ways to just clearly clarify the information that's important to students in doing the project. We also want to create procedure charts and rubrics and how-to guides that allow students to follow along, not only our oral language, but to follow along from some kind of a guide, some kind of a form. Providing photos or other visual information is really key. We can also demonstrate what is expected and let students know when we watch them if they're doing it in the way that we expect or how we might help them, support them to do it in a slightly different way. So in this picture here, you see a classroom, a kindergarten classroom that has a center system set up, and the teacher has a regular routine that she uses with her students. So they see their names, they see their activities. There's color coding that helps them understand. It's organized in a way where even if they can't completely follow the information that she's speaking aloud, they can use their visual and routine procedure kind of information to follow what she is saying. So let's do a few examples. I'll try to do this with each of the areas, the practices that I'm focusing on. If you look on the left, we see something that's not very explicit. We see a teacher talking only. Most likely, this teacher is doing too much talking, but we also know from data that teachers in general do too much talking in the classroom, and their students are usually sitting there listening. The students are in non-interactive seating. In other words, they're all looking forward to the teacher and they're trying to follow what he's saying. They're trying to keep up with the stream of language. And what tends to happen with students who are learning in a new language is they can keep at it for a while, but then they sort of fill up and they need a break. And in that break, they need to process what they're learning. They need to talk to somebody else. They need to do something with the language. But just to sit there and assume that it's just going to keep filling in ends up maxing them out. And that's why we see them looking like they're sleepy or zoning out or just not being able to attend anymore. Whereas if you look at the right, we see a teacher who was sharing a picture book, nonfiction picture book. She's explaining some key words that are coming on the back of those pictures. She has kid-friendly definitions of what those words mean. She repeats this book daily over the course of a week. And so students get opportunities to really hear those words over and over, understand their meaning, and see them in a holistic context of the picture book. Here's another example of a not very explicit and a more explicit. So again, on the left, we see a teacher at the front looking for students looking forward. There's not much visual reinforcement. You see a little bit of visual, but it's so far away, students can't really make it out or use it. Again, there's an expectation that the teacher is the teller and the students are the receivers of this information. On the right, on the other hand, we see more of a gather around and learn something through physical artifacts and visuals. We see colors, we see diagrams, we see objects. We appear to see some questioning going on, some interaction between the teacher and the student, and some demonstration. We can see with the pieces on the ground that there's actual artifacts. So students who are not even able to keep up fully with the flow of information orally can also gather information from some of the physical artifacts that are in the room. And again, we have another example of not very explicit and more explicit. So the student on the left may be hearing something like, okay, it's time to go do your work. There's kind of a lack of clarity. The student's trying to read the teacher's mind. Like, what am I supposed to do? What does work consist of? Oftentimes, English learners will look at other students to see what they're doing and try to do what they're doing too. But if they don't really have the sense of what's expected, that can lead them to emulate students who aren't on track or who they don't really understand the purpose of what they're doing if they haven't been given clear instructions. Whereas on the right, we see a teacher who has developed a procedure chart for word study throughout the course of the week. So students know on Monday, these are the things we do. On Tuesday, these are the things we do. Thursday, Friday, etc. So students, even if they aren't able to keep up with the oral flow of language, are able to get the work done. And you'll see, I have, at least when I've been in classrooms, students who are learning language, well, they're the ones who are constantly referring to their sheet. They're going up and looking at the procedure charts in class, the anchor charts in class, because they really need them. It's really essential for their learning. So explicitness is hugely important, and we can all be better at it. I know, I'll speak for myself. Like every time you think you're doing something super explicitly and then you find somebody doesn't understand, you're like, oh, I could have done that one more thing to make this more explicit. Let's talk about another practice. This is the practice of engaging students in interactive lessons. So the why behind this is that interaction allows students to practice new skills in low-stress settings. They are motivated to participate. It allows them to show what they know, not just directly to the teacher, but to their peers and in multiple ways. And it gives a chance for their peers to give them feedback as well. One chapter that I wrote, Catherine Au did one book that I wrote, Catherine Au did a chapter, and she described this principle of a classroom full of teachers. And when you have students learning a new language in class, it's really helpful to have a classroom full of teachers. All the kids can be your teachers too. So students who speak the same language as a student can be teachers, and students who speak a different language from students can be teachers. But got to get the whole group working together to make sure that everybody's language gets some practice. So let's do some compare and contrast again. Again, if we look at the left, I would say this is not very interactive. We've already talked about kind of the teacher at the front and the students positioned as receivers. That's not very helpful for language learning. We call this the IRE model, where the teacher initiates a question, the students respond, and then the teacher evaluates yes or no. Yes, that was good, or no, no. Does somebody else have a different idea, or something like that? But it's the kind of interaction that does not encourage participation. It encourages a few kids who know the answer to say it, but usually your students learning in a new language will not be the ones raising their hand and not be the ones getting language practice. Whereas if we look at the right, we see a group of preschoolers who each have a little card. One has an ear, one has a mouth, and their teacher is asking them some questions. And the person with the ear gets to be a good listener, while the person with the mouth gets to say the answer. And then periodically, every minute or so, they change cards and they get opportunities to practice. So that's a highly structured interaction that ensures that everybody is talking and everybody is listening and some good language skills are being practiced. Okay, here's again, compare the two, not very interactive and more interactive. On the left, we see a student writing, and the student, not that writing is bad, there's a time definitely for writing by yourself. But in terms of interaction, we want it to go beyond that. When you're writing by yourself, there's limited support, and those who can do well will, and others may not do so well. Their learning is more of an isolated activity and there's not much language practice. So we see on the right a more interactive approach where the text is being co-constructed by a group. It's supported by peer interactions, tends to be more meaningful and motivating, especially students who would struggle to do the work on their own. Everyone moves forward. Those who are, very good or for whom it comes easily can learn to be those teachers, those guides in the classroom, and others will learn sometimes often very much better from their peers than they would from a direct lesson by the teacher in the whole group. So everyone moves forward in this more interactive approach. Another thing to do is when you do have individual writing, then later have opportunities for partner shares or opportunities for kids to work with each other so that you can make a not very interactive activity more interactive. Again, on the left, we see a student reading, independent reading, silent reading, which is great. Certainly we want time for kids to read. It's not that it's bad. It's just in terms of what we're talking about right now, it may not be as motivating or supportive for emergent bilinguals. They may need some kind of interactive connection, either co-reading a book, reading it and sharing with each other, or as we see on the right here, a book club where reading happens, but then it's shared with others. So there's an authentic purpose, a real world value, and students get to practice language. So again, we can take things we already do and then just add an interactive component to them. Okay, moving to our third key practice is to show that you value your students' home language skills and connect those to learning English. Now, why is this important? Well, new learning builds on what we already know. Making connections to students' background knowledge enhances what they're about to learn, their new conceptual learning. And it also demonstrates that the student's whole being is valued, their language, culture, and home communities as well. So language is an amazing thing. What we know in a language can be transferred into another language. We know that bilinguals are not two separate monolinguals who switch on and off their brains from one side to another. We know that a multilingual, bilingual person uses all their brain and connects things constantly, which is one of the reasons why bilingualism is so great. It really helps people to multitask because they're able to shift and move back across different contents and concepts. So bilingualism is good and we want to encourage that. And we want to share that with students. We want them to know that it's amazing that they're halfway there to being bilingual. Now they just need to work on the English part. So compare the following. The left side does not value home languages. It somehow says this is an English only space. This is the only language we care about at school is English. If you're not using English, you're taking away from your learning of English, and it puts kids in the position of thinking that there's a bad language and a good language, and the good language is English, and for some reason your parents and your families and your communities don't speak the good language. So that's a problem. It's a problem for self-esteem. It's a problem for learning. It's a problem for language development, bilingualism, and many, many things. We really don't want to communicate that message that students should only speak English at school. They can learn so much by using their home languages. So if we look at the right-hand side, we see that a welcoming place, a welcoming school, a welcoming classroom says, hey, we know you speak other languages and we think that's great. We want to really cherish all of the multilingualism at our school and make sure that we know who you are in your language, in your culture, in your family, in your community, and we will build on that at school. Couldn't find really great pictures for this one, but I didn't want to just, put up a teacher looking angry or anything. But anyway, if we look on the left, the types of questions that tend to get asked in a place that isn't really seeking deep knowledge from a student is, do you know the answer? Tell me the answer. And the answer is typically has to be like on the spot in front of other people, has to be in English. It's very high, high pressure. It often causes students to really kind of be tense and develop anxiety. And so that's not a way to value their home language. Instead, if you are able as a teacher to use language that lets kids show you other ways that they know it, like tell me how to say that in your home language. Do you have a way to say this? How would your parents describe this? What would you do at home that could help me understand what you know about this? That's saying you can bring everything you know into class. You can bring everything you know and share it. And I'm going to try to make a connection to what we're learning about here in school. Lots of ways to do that. We could have a whole topic just on all the good questions you could ask to students to really encourage them to tell you what they know. Another comparison, sometimes people have the idea that school is the center. That the leftist doesn't really value the home language. It says school is what's important and school is what gives out information. So everything, so we're going to have, and there's nothing wrong with, parent literacy nights or anything where we're teaching parents and families things. That's okay. But if that's the only thing that happens, it's sending the message that school has the knowledge that we're sending to you and you need to be receivers of this knowledge. Where if we look at the right-hand side, when we value the home languages, we know that it's not just about school. For students, it's school and home need to work together. Schools and educators need to learn from the home communities, and the home communities need to learn from the school processes as well. So it's bi-directional. So anytime we can do something that creates that bi-directional shift, that is what we want. And that shows that we value not only the learning that's happening at school, but what students bring from their homes and communities as well. So as we think about these three processes, just want you to take a minute and think about these questions for yourself, because I think we all have things we can all get better. I can get better. We can all get better. Just need how many days and hours in the day. But even if we don't take the extra time to plan specifically, sometimes it's just about our behavior in class and our interactions with students, the questions we ask and the ways we draw from them, maybe even just adapt our speech, set up our procedures so that we know that they are understanding them more easily. So a couple questions like, how can I add enhancements to make my instruction more explicit? Think of one thing that you could do that you've seen an idea from or been sparked by today. How can I assess my students' understanding of procedural and content knowledge in class? Now, this happens informally in class where we give instructions and then we see which kids can't do it. But think about, is there some way you could make that a little bit more formalized? How could you be able to tell which of your students are really having difficulty following the procedural and content knowledge in class? Are there new ways, multimodal ways for students to demonstrate what they're learning? Does it always have to be with language or writing, or are there other ways to show? and, become a collector of visuals and artifacts that will help students better understand tasks. And think about how will talking with family members maybe help you understand what the students already know and what strengths they're bringing to class as well.
This is your host once again, Corey Stye. I am Director of Research and Partnership Development here at Read Naturally. At this time, we're going to transition from Lori's presentation to an interview, a conversation and discussion to dig deeper into some of these topics that you've shared today. Lori, thanks for joining us for this presentation. When we landed on the topic of supporting multilingual learners for this webinar, you were the first person to come to mind. Registrants for this webinar submitted dozens of topics and questions. I want to thank our viewers for those submissions. We're going to try to address as many of the most burning issues in the minds of our participants today as we have time for with Lori. It's not surprising that one of the most prevalent topics raised for today's webinar was that of vocabulary instruction. So let's start there. What is most important when thinking about vocabulary development for students learning English in the classroom?
Good question. And by the way, I did scan many of your questions, and wow, really great questions. Made me think, you might need to write a book about this, or two or three, right? Vocabulary is hugely important because we know that you can't comprehend a text if you don't know the vocabulary words. You can't understand a content area, a science or social studies, if you don't understand what the vocabulary means. So without vocabulary, there will be no true conceptual understanding or comprehension. So yes, vocabulary, hugely important. We need to think about vocabulary in every lesson that we do, even if we're simply reading a short picture book or having students read a simple passage. Need to think about how the vocabulary might or might not be accessible. So a couple things for teachers to do. First of all is, as you look at material, if you have time to preview, that's really great. It's important because then you can decide what key vocabulary is most important. So for instance, if you're reading let's say you're doing a read aloud of a, picture book, you can't stop and teach every word that you think the kids don't know, but what are the handful of words that students will not get the same information from that you hope they will? Like, what are the key themes or words that are just the book is not going to make sense if they don't understand those words. So those are the words you're going to want to kind of single out and help and scaffold for students. You can always do it ahead of time. You can do it during if you have a group where a lot of students need that vocabulary, but you got to decide which words are most important. And then think about how are you going to learn those words multimodally. So not only from just explaining what the word means. Can you have pictures? Can you look it up on the internet? Can you act it out? Can you have somebody demonstrate it with their body? So learning words beyond just using other words to explain, that's really critical. And then think about if this is an important word. Let's say you're about to do a unit of study, and it's clear that students will need to know, a set of key words. Make a vocabulary word wall, put up on the pocket chart or on a bulletin board where some of the key words that are going to be used in that unit are up with pictures. And so kids can use it when they write. They can use it when they need access to, what was that word again? I'm going to go look that up. They can even do these vocabulary word pages in some kind of a vocabulary notebook that they have themselves. But give them opportunities to hear and use the words. Maybe if you do a writing assignment, say, I want you to use 5 of those words that are up on that vocabulary word wall in this writing. And then, set up opportunities for them to talk with each other. Turn to your partner and use 2 of these words in a sentence about, whatever the topic is. So put them into practice through authentic, interactive work. So those are some just like key ideas.
Great, thanks, Lori. To bring that into our programs, there are keywords that are introduced prior to their reading, along with the audio pronunciations and the definitions and some illustrations. And one thing that we can do to support our bilingual students is to encourage them to use those within their written predictions, or if you choose to modify the story options to have them speak their prediction step or their retelling to you orally, to encourage them to utilize those keywords within those opportunities within that work. There were a number of webinar participants that asked questions about wanting to know support about reading instruction in general, and many of those were pretty broad, possibly reflecting the complexity of reading instruction. What thoughts would you have for educators to keep in mind when providing reading instruction, whether general instruction or intervention?
Good question too. And I know folks are at very different grade levels and whatnot, but some just important points I think are that emergent bilinguals can learn reading skills in a similar manner to native speakers. And now this by skills there, what I mean are like letter sounds, phonics, phonemic awareness, hearing sounds and words. There's been a number of studies that say, that emergent bilinguals can do that as easily in almost as quickly as native speakers. So so keep doing those skills, do all those foundational skills, and you should expect your students to be learning them at a quick pace, as you would expect your native English speaking students to. While you're doing those skills, there may be some cross-language application happening. Sometimes we call that transfer. So there could be some difficulties. Let's say, for instance, I've worked a lot with Spanish speakers who have a really hard time distinguishing between certain like short vowel sounds, like the difference between and I, like in the words pen or pin. So in terms of the phonics, you may have to help students distinguish those different sounds. I wouldn't overly focus on pronunciation, but there are times when you know that the things are going to be harder just because students can't distinguish those different sounds. But other than that, the basic skills of phonics and phonemic awareness should happen, as quickly and systematically as they do for other students. In terms of fluency, one thing that has also been found that sometimes fluency is used as a kind of a proxy for comprehension. Like if a student is reading something and it sounds like they are understanding what's going on, they're kind of an expressive, fluent way, that good, they must be comprehending too. And that works pretty well for native speakers. That does not work as well for second language learners. So sometimes English learners can sound fluent, but not really understand what they're reading. And that's partly because, there's a lot of vocabulary in text. And if they don't know what all those words mean, they could sound fluent, but not comprehend. And then it gets to the big idea here that the biggest challenge for students learning to read in a new language is comprehending the text, because of so many unknown vocabulary words and unfamiliar sentence structures. So, I did a study where we followed kids for their 6 years of elementary school, and we found that many of them did not have issues at all with learning the skills, but all of them, even the ones who were at or above grade level in terms of their testing, had significant issues around comprehension of academic texts. So to really keep focusing on those academic words and sentence structures, even as you get into the upper grades, is really critical, because comprehension is going to be the biggest long-term challenge.
Great. Yeah, there's a couple of research studies out there that have found even the simple act of queuing up fluency instruction to say at the outset that this isn't just about speed, but to focus on both your fluent reading smoothly and expressively, and to focus on comprehension. That mere act of teachers setting up the act as being those two things in tandem, that what we're working on, shows additional and increased benefit for students. So really important to keep in mind. There were about a dozen variations on our following question, and that is, how do you support a newcomer who comes to school knowing almost no English? Now, that's a big question, and there's a reason that we have professionals that get separate licensure and degrees in this area to learn all of the complexity of what that entails. But are there a few do's and don'ts that you can highlight today for educators to keep in mind when working with learners at the earliest stages of English language development, or those who may have limited or interrupted formal education coming into their classroom?
Mm-hmm. Well, start by doing the things we talked about in the webinar. Those 3 practices are like the biggest ones, so do those. That's great. Especially, I think it's important to find out what your students know in both their home language and English. So if we can't just rely on the standardized yearly assessment because we tend to not get that information until later. We need to do a lot of informal assessment of students' language. Work with, if you have an EL specialist at your school on that. If no one has found out what the child knows from in another language, either orally or in writing, and in terms of literacy, find it out, because that can be a great bridge to literacy in English. So yeah, definitely do that. If you have students who speak the same language as the newcomer, pair them up and let the person who's been here longer be kind of a language broker for the student. It's okay to do that for a while. It's not forever. It's just the beginning. It's just, they're going to want to take, do more English too. You're not, it's not like you're giving them a crutch and then never taking it away. It's really about making them feel welcome in the class, helping them understand what's going on, and allowing them to feel supported. So if there's not another student who can do that, do you have any kind of a community liaison or other kind of member of the community who speaks that language, who can come in at least, periodically, and if nothing else, ask the child, are there questions you have that I can ask your teacher right now that you're not able to communicate, just to help them feel part of the community and know that they're valued, and that you're doing everything you can to support them. Definitely. So using family members and community resources is a must. And I think a big idea is to remember that even though students don't have much English, that doesn't mean they don't have anything. They have language. Yes, they have language. And so how are you going to get them, like maybe if you can have them do assignments in a language that they have, that's great. If they don't have much written language, there's multimodal ways. There's drawing. There's other options for communicating what they know. Students most likely will be highly motivated to learn English and content at school. And if you can just give them, the basics to start with, they are going to love it. They are going to do everything they can to get better at it. And yeah, it's just a matter of trusting that they have capacity, even if they don't have proficiency in English.
Right. And by providing those opportunities, you can leverage that language knowledge that they bring into the classroom, and that transfers into their acquisition of English as they move forward. I want to piggyback on that, on a few questions that were specifically asked about Read Naturally Live and supports for the earliest learners. And specifically, how early can somebody use the program effectively, which really bears on our earliest learners within the language. And so our Encore Teacher's Manual and Read Live Users Guide have some information on guidance for using programs with emergent readers. In a nutshell, we found that a student who knows their beginning sounds and approximately 50 words, and those words don't have to come from any specific word list. It's just a rough estimate of a very beginning emerging sight word vocabulary. That when students come to the program with those ability to recognize initial sounds and have some of those foundational words, that they typically have the skill to recognize whether the word that he or she is viewing in the story matches the word being spoken by the narrator, and that the audio supports allow them to connect in along with the many, many other supports that are there to have success within the program. So those are our basic guidelines. Any student that hasn't quite reached that point needs to continue to receive instruction or intervention in that phonemic awareness and phonics, which they may receive in addition to the program, but those are really our recommendations, what we found to be effective for students beginning the program. I want to highlight just one other thing about the content, and that is the 3 series that we have available. In addition to the sequence series, which is the basic standard series, the phonics series provides explicit systematic phonics instruction, which is at the core of all of our programs. And so those stories are specifically written to reinforce the phonics features of the story and level in which the students are working, and the opening phonics lesson that students receive at the beginning of each story, providing those opportunities to practice with those decodable texts. And then our 3rd series, the idiom series, which is available at levels 3.0 through 4.5, teach our multilingual learners new to English and still perhaps learning American English, nearly 140 common American expressions throughout the course of those additional supplemental stories available in that particular series. So just a couple of things to keep in mind. That's the last interjection I'm going to do in the webinar, but we're going to follow up with some resources in the follow-up email that does more to highlight some of the features that will specifically support your English learners throughout. So just wanted to answer that question about when can kids start using that program, knowing many of our participants today use some of our programs. So there were a number of people that asked questions to you of the best way to determine if a student is struggling with reading due to the language barrier or due to reading difficulty or a disability, that intersection between our English learner supports and our special education services. Can you talk to us a little bit about what's the best way to determine, not that there's one best way, but what are ways in which schools can approach that tricky question of, is this language, is this disability?
Right. And one of the reasons this question is so important is because of the overrepresentation and underrepresentation of students in special education and or intervention. So we don't want to make the mistake on either side, right? We don't want to say it's only language, so let's just wait and not give support to a student,
Right.
because then students won't be identified who need support. Also, it's not just like everybody who doesn't speak English ought to be in special ed, because that's not the case either. So we're trying to find that right balance. Well, one thing to figure out, in terms of even wondering if there's some kind of an issue around dyslexia or reading difficulties, is to think about whether the student has any perhaps language delays or other issues that seem to be surfacing. So what an educator can do is talk to other people who know the students, like maybe a previous year's teacher or maybe a family member. They can compare the language development and the growth of the student in question with other, maybe perhaps siblings or other, students that they know. I think getting an outside, an opinion of somebody who knows the student well is a good idea. You can also look at the opportunities that the student has had. The student maybe hasn't ever even been taught officially, formally English. And then you're concerned that they're not learning. I think it's still, figure out, is this an opportunity gap or is this a learning problem? So what opportunities, has there been a lot of absence? Absence can cause a limited amount of progress too. So these are all things we want to look at. We want to, if possible, give an assessment in the home language, because that can tell us if there's a difference between how the student performs in the home language versus in English. One thing we describe in the assessment book, that's not the one I'm focusing on here, but the other one that came out this year, was to look for a true peer. In other words, a fellow student who has a similar level of language, maybe has been around for the same amount of time, had similar educational background. How is the student doing in relation to a true peer? Not a generic monolingual student X, but to a peer that has had similar educational experiences and opportunities. And that's going to tell you something too. The main thing I'll just say is that we want to provide intervention in a tiered system to the student who, a similar manner to the student who's a native speaker. Because if we hold off on intervention and wait for language to develop, that student is never going to be able to catch up, because that train is rolling down the track and it's going to be really hard to catch up. So provide intervention, from when you suspect, see what happens, and then if more intervention is needed, including language development intervention, do it. Just we want to get as much to the student as we can.
Right. Yeah, definitely not employing a wait to fail model, but being supportive and proactive up front. Right.
Yeah.
So a lot of our participant questions were around general education, the number of students that are mainstreamed either transitionally or due to lack of support for the students the way that they might like to offer them. And this is kind of a two-pronged question. One on support, how do you best support students within the content areas and within their classrooms? And then there was a line of questions as well about how might professionals like speech language therapists, ESL teachers support content area classroom teachers in that. And so can you talk a little bit about sort of the general classroom content area supports as a topic?
Yes. So you're completely right. It's a team effort. This is not, something that needs to be carried on the backs of individual teachers. Even though this session was focused on teacher behaviors, it's a team effort. It's everybody, and it's the system too, the systemic things that can come into place. So I've had a couple of my students at the university who've done research studies, their dissertation studies on teams of people. So teams that have classroom teachers, that have ELL specialists, that have reading specialists, special educators, and that team looking at students, their progress, what they need, are so much more effective than one person trying to figure this out all themselves. So teamwork is key, definitely. We all have a stake in student success, and we all have contributions to make to that success. We want to make sure that our students are receiving cohesive instruction. If they're getting an intervention somewhere else outside of the classroom, we want to make sure that they're getting consistent messages across both of those services. So we also want to include community-based knowledge in learning how to be effective with our students. So that bidirectional part that I talked about, how do we really find out if what we're trying to do with students is culturally appropriate, or if we might need to tweak a little bit in order to have it be more effective with our students. Cohesiveness, cultural relevance, teamwork, group decision-making. And then I think from this longitudinal study I did, over the long run, I would say that it's important to not just look at a single year of data to see how students are growing across the years. We found such a year by year vision that a lot of students missed out on getting the services they needed because nobody kind of tracked them from beginning of first grade, through elementary school, and to see that, they should have been doing much better than they were. So that longer term perspective is really important, and that teamwork and systemic ways of looking at student data is also really critical.
Right. So much of what you just encapsulated are those critical core components of a multi-tiered system of support. And I love that the focus of the book is on some of those systemic issues and ways to get all teachers to leverage their knowledge and their unique knowledge and their interactions with students and families that may be different from other people in the system, and to make sure as adults we bring all of that together to make sure we're making the best decisions and doing the monitoring necessary to see that students are growing as much as they can at any given point. So important. I think the last question we'll cover here today, as I'm looking at the clock and dismayed that we're running out of time because it's so beneficial.
Nobody has anything else to do though, right?
Yeah, right. A lot of questions about oral language development broadly. What is it? How do you incorporate it along with other skill building around the literacies and so on? So can you suggest some strategies to promote oral language development within the classroom for educators in particular?
Right. And these things do not require like going and constructing these huge lessons. These are things that can be built just right into what you're doing already in the classroom. So that's what I tried to communicate in the presentation as well. So some of the things you've already seen are having students partner or work in collaborative teams. That is a really great way. They're going to talk much more with a partner or with a team than they will when called on individually in front of the whole class. So that's a really good way to get some practice. You can structure interactions with procedures or props. So, having like fake microphones or real ones, using real digital recording devices, musical instruments where they, chant along, but, TV screens, all different props you could have that will get some kids talking where they might not have if it's just them by themselves. If you give them a
Right,
prop, suddenly they become Mr. or Ms. Talker,
right.
that's great. Having language partners across, in whatever language, someone who can speak a language that's not English with you, and all those kinds of things are great. I also think that we don't think enough about the kind of participation that gets kids using their voices, but isn't putting them on the spot. So for instance, like chanting along, like having a poem, everybody's chanting along. You'll see kids using their voice that will not open their voice, open up at all during the rest of the day. But if they're chanting along or singing along or doing choral reading, being a part of readers theater where they're not the only person reading that part, but where it's a number of people. These are all ways to get their, once they start using their voices in class, they become a little bit more open to using their voices singly too. So just got to get those voices being used in low stress kind of groupings. Another thing we didn't talk about, but is always a good one, is to have sentence stems or sentence frames. So if you're wanting students to say things in whole sentences or respond to content area prompts like my opinion is blank. Everybody has to start their sentence with my opinion is, now say the rest. Or a mammal has these properties, that it just structures the language in a way that teaches language, but also gets everybody talking. So basically every lesson has to be a language learning lesson. It doesn't have to be formally scripted, but you should think about what vocabulary and what sentence structures are being supported and practiced in every single lesson that's happening in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. And just as with vocabulary development, the use of a word wall can be an ongoing visual support. Those sentence stems also can become a set of stems that
Mm-hmm.
may go throughout a unit or lesson or recur until students have mastered those different kind of language forms as they go. There is a question that came in live here that I wanted to bring up because it was also mirrored in some of our previous questions. And so I'll just read our live participant question. Is there a difference when teaching or presenting information to emergent bilinguals or non-English speaking students who enter school in high school or middle school versus students who enter in elementary school? What, if anything, looks differently for older students?
Yeah, the principles are the same. I don't know if you'll get away with singing or chanting along, but maybe you will, especially if you choose materials that are more age appropriate. So yeah, you need to look at the maturity level of the materials. I would recommend that photographs tend to do better than drawings because drawings tend to be cartoonish, but there's cartoons that older students like too.
Mm-hmm.
The key principles we've talked about of inclusiveness, like valuing the whole student. They may not have had much schooling, but that doesn't mean they haven't had life experiences
Right.
and language and knowledge that they can share. So valuing what they're bringing is really key. Starting probably the difference you would probably start with survival type of literacy activities like, addresses, stop signs, bus forms, job applications. You might do some of that, but then in the end, you're going to want to go back to the basic early literacy principles. You just want to do it in a way that does not seem like you're doing a kindergarten or first grade thing.
Thank you again, Lori, and thanks to everyone for attending our webinar or spending time out of your day to listen to it. Another reminder that we will be sending out follow-up emails with links to the recording in about 24 hours, so please take a look for that in your inbox. Feel free to share the recording with anyone at your school or district or in your professional network who could benefit from its content. And finally, if you could, please respond to the survey that will appear on your screen as you exit the webinar so we can continue to improve these educational experiences for all of you in the future. Thanks again, and have a wonderful day.